The federal courtroom was silent, yet the tension was heavy. Cameras flashed. Every eye was fixed on the man, sitting high above the room. The judge leaned back, tapping his gavel on the desk, a slow smirk spreading across his face. His voice dripped with amusement as he spoke. "Miss Leavitt, your claims are bold, but I see no proof. Are we here for justice, or is this just another political show?" Laughter echoed through the courtroom. Some chuckled nervously. Others stayed quiet, sensing something was coming. Karoline Leavitt stood tall. She did not flinch. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with purpose. The judge shook his head. "Justice is not about feelings. It is about facts. You have none." His arrogance filled the room. He was certain he was untouchable. But then, Leavitt reached into her file. She placed a document on the desk. "Your Honor, I believe this will speak for itself." The courtroom grew still. The judge leaned forward, his smirk fading as he read. A murmur spread through the crowd. The air changed. Leavitt's voice cut through the silence. "You took bribes, manipulated verdicts, and thought no one would find out. But today, we bring the truth to light." The judge opened his mouth, but no words came. His fingers tightened around the gavel. Then footsteps echoed. Officers entered the courtroom. A voice rang out. "Judge Thompson, you are under arrest." The gavel slipped from his grip. His laughter had disappeared. Justice had arrived. When did justice become a joke? And why do those in power believe they are untouchable? Watch closely. The game has changed. The courtroom was packed. Reporters whispered. Cameras clicked. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, young, determined, and unshaken. She had made a name for herself by exposing corruption, never backing down, no matter how powerful her enemies were. She straightened her papers, eyes locked on the man before her. Judge Richard Thompson, a man with decades of influence, a man whose name had been whispered in dark corners, tied to scandals no one dared to investigate. But today, there was no hiding. The judge leaned forward, a smirk playing on his lips. He tapped his fingers against the bench, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Miss Leavitt," he said, voice slow and condescending, "you have built quite a career on accusations. Bold words, but words alone do not prove anything." Some in the audience chuckled. Others stayed silent, sensing something was coming. Leavitt did not react. She studied him, her expression unreadable. The judge sighed dramatically. "I admire your enthusiasm, but this is not a political rally. This is a court of law. Evidence matters here. Do you have any?" The words dripped with mockery. He was not just dismissing her case. He was mocking her, making a spectacle of her determination. She let the silence stretch, let his arrogance fill the room. Then she spoke. "You are right, Your Honor. This is a court of law. That is why I have come prepared." She reached into her file and pulled out a thick document. She placed it on the desk before him. The judge's smile faltered for a brief moment. Just a flicker, a tiny shift, but it was there. He picked up the papers, flipping through the pages lazily. Then suddenly his hand froze. His eyes darted back to the first page. Leavitt's voice was steady. "That is a record of financial transactions. Large sums of money, deposited into offshore accounts. The names. Well, I will let you read them yourself." The audience shifted. The tension in the room grew sharper. The judge cleared his throat. He set the papers down, clasped his hands together, and forced a smile. "I see what you are trying to do," he said. "This is a desperate attempt to discredit me. These documents mean nothing." Leavitt did not blink. "There is more." She pulled out another folder. "This is a transcript, a conversation between you and a well-known corporate lobbyist. You promised favorable rulings. In exchange, they promised." "Enough," the judge snapped. His smirk was gone. His hands gripped the bench tightly. Leavitt took a step forward. "You called me a naive politician, but I came here for the truth. And now the whole country is watching." Silence. Heavy. Unbreakable. The power had shifted. And for the first time, the judge knew it. The courtroom was tense. Every seat was filled. Every camera focused. The entire nation was watching. Judge Richard Thompson sat high above the room, relaxed, completely at ease. He had seen many politicians try to challenge the system. None had succeeded. He exhaled dramatically and leaned back. His fingers tapped the gavel like a toy, a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. "This has been entertaining." A few chuckles echoed in the crowd. The judge smiled. "But let us be honest. You stand here, waving documents, spinning stories, hoping to stir outrage. This is not a courtroom strategy. It is theater." He turned to the audience, shaking his head. "She wants you to believe there is some grand conspiracy, a powerful man twisting justice from the shadows." He scoffed. "Miss Leavitt, have you considered writing novels? This is fiction." A few in the crowd laughed again. He was mocking her, belittling her. Leavitt stayed still. The judge continued. "You claim I have taken bribes, that I have made rulings based on influence, not law." He spread his hands. "And yet where's the proof? A few pieces of paper? This is not evidence. This is desperation." He smirked and leaned forward. "Let me give you some advice, Miss Leavitt. Politics is a game, a brutal one. You are young, ambitious, but naive. You think standing here, making accusations, will bring you power. It will not. The system does not work that way." His eyes locked on hers. "And neither do I." Leavitt remained silent. Her expression did not change. The judge's smile widened. "You remind me of a child who believes they can change the rules just by wishing hard enough. But reality does not bend to emotion. The law is the law." He tapped the gavel again. Slow, taunting. "You came here for justice. But justice is not found in speeches. It is found in facts. And right now, the facts are not in your favor." He turned to the courtroom. "This case is weak. It is built on conspiracy and fantasy. I am considering whether we should waste more time on this." Leavitt finally moved. She reached for her folder. "Calm. Steady." The judge sighed. "More papers." He waved a hand. "Go ahead. But I warn you, I have little patience left." She lifted a single document and placed it in front of him. "Your Honor," she said, voice firm, "this is a signed affidavit from a federal investigator. It details multiple instances of judicial misconduct, including direct financial transactions between your accounts and a corporate lobbyist." The judge's smirk flickered. The cameras clicked. The room held its breath. Leavitt was not finished. She placed another document on the table. "This is a transcript of a phone call. Your voice, discussing favorable rulings in exchange for undisclosed payments." Silence. The judge's fingers tightened around the gavel. Leavitt's voice remained steady. "You asked where the proof was. Here it is." The judge's face was unreadable, but his knuckles had turned white. He exhaled through his nose, lips pressing into a thin line. Then he let out a low chuckle. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice had lost its mocking tone. "Do you think waving papers will change anything?" Leavitt tilted her head. "No, Your Honor, but I do think the truth will." The judge's smirk was gone. His time was running out. The courtroom had been his stage. The judge had controlled the tempo, the tone, and the outcome. He had laughed. He had mocked. He had turned a legal hearing into a spectacle. But now something had shifted. Karoline Leavitt stood firm, hand steady as she placed another document on the table. Her expression was unreadable. No anger, no frustration, just quiet confidence. The judge scoffed. "More paper." He waved a dismissive hand. "I have already explained, Miss Leavitt. Allegations are not facts. A signature here, a statement there. It means nothing without concrete proof." He leaned back, tapping the gavel against his bench. "You are wasting this court's time." Leavitt did not react. She simply slid the document forward. "Then let us talk about proof." The judge rolled his eyes, but something in the room felt different. The audience had gone still. The air was heavier. Leavitt continued, her voice steady. "This is a federal financial audit. It traces a series of offshore deposits, large sums of money, sent to an account under a name that, at first, meant nothing. She paused. Until we ran a deeper search. The judge shifted slightly in his seat. The tapping of the gavel stopped. Leavitt turned a page. The account holder? Richard Thompson. The same name as yours, Your Honor. But this account was not declared. Not in any public record. Not in any tax filing. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The cameras flashed. The judge gave a dry laugh. A coincidence. You are reaching, Miss Leavitt. Names are not evidence. Leavitt met his gaze. That is why I brought more. She placed another folder in front of him. This is a transcript. A recorded phone call between you and a corporate lobbyist, discussing favorable rulings. The judge's smirk vanished. Leavitt tapped the folder. Shall I read it aloud? His jaw tightened. Leavitt opened the document. You said, and I quote, I can make this case disappear, but it will cost you. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The judge's fingers gripped the bench. His face was pale now, the arrogance fading. But Leavitt was not finished. She lifted one last folder. And finally this. The judge exhaled sharply. More fiction. Leavitt shook her head. This is a sealed document. One that was supposed to remain hidden. She turned toward the back of the courtroom. A man in a dark suit stood. He had not been there before. No one had noticed him enter. But now all eyes were on him. He stepped forward and handed a file to Leavitt. She took it without looking, placing it on the desk before the judge. This, she said, is a sworn affidavit from an insider. Someone who worked closely with you. Someone who had access to sealed case files, payment records, and private meetings. The judge said nothing. Leavitt opened the file. This document outlines direct communication between you and multiple high-profile figures. It details how cases were manipulated. It lists dates, times, names. The judge swallowed. Leavitt looked up. Would you like me to continue? Silence. The once smug judge was frozen. The courtroom was waiting. Leavitt closed the folder. You once said the law is the law. She let the words hang. I agree. The cameras zoomed in. The nation was watching. And for the first time, the judge knew. His time had run out. The courtroom was silent. The weight of the evidence had settled over the room like a storm cloud, thick and heavy. The judge sat still, his usual smirk gone. But then he laughed. A short, sharp sound. He straightened his robe, tapping the gavel again. This is absurd, he said. This is nothing more than political theater. He pointed at Karoline Leavitt. You are trying to turn this courtroom into a circus, but I will not allow it. Leavitt remained calm. She did not speak. She did not need to. The judge leaned forward. This hearing is over. He lifted his gavel, but before he could strike it down, Leavitt spoke. On what grounds? The judge's eyes narrowed. On the grounds that your so-called evidence is meaningless. The financial records? Unverified. The transcript? A fabrication. And this sealed document? He scoffed. A desperate stunt. He gestured toward security. Remove her from this courtroom immediately. The guard stepped forward, but before they could reach her, a voice called out. Stand down. The words came from the side of the room. A court official had risen from his seat. He held a small earpiece in his hand, his expression unreadable. The judge's head snapped toward him. What did you say? The official walked forward and leaned down, whispering something in the judge's ear. And in that moment, everything changed. The judge's face drained of color. His fingers, which had been gripping the gavel tightly, loosened. He blinked rapidly, swallowing hard. Leavitt watched him carefully. Something wrong, Your Honor? He did not answer. He sat frozen, his hands trembling slightly. The courtroom was waiting. Then, the door at the back of the room opened. A group of men in dark suits entered. Their movements were controlled, precise. They did not hesitate. One of them approached the judge's bench and placed a small piece of paper in front of him. The judge read it, and for the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Leavitt spoke again, her voice even. I believe you just received official notification of a federal investigation. Am I correct? The judge's jaw tightened. He looked at the men before him, then at the cameras lining the courtroom. Millions were watching. He cleared his throat. This hearing is adjourned. He tried to stand, but the man in front of him shook his head. "Your Honor," he said, "you need to come with us." The judge inhaled sharply. "This is a mistake." The man did not move. "Please stand up." The judge hesitated. Then, finally, with slow, measured movements, he rose to his feet. One of the agents stepped behind him. Cold steel clicked around his wrists. Handcuffs. A sound rippled through the courtroom. A mix of gasps, whispers, and the rapid clicking of cameras. Leavitt stayed where she was, watching as the once powerful judge was led away. His arrogance had vanished. His power had crumbled. And justice, at last, had taken its place. The courtroom stood still. The air was thick with tension as heavy boots echoed against the marble floor. Officers moved with purpose, their presence undeniable. The judge, once smug and untouchable, sat frozen. A man in uniform stepped forward. His voice was firm. "Your Honor, by order of the federal court, you are under arrest." Silence. The judge's fingers twitched. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. "This is ridiculous," he finally said. "You cannot do this. I am the law in this courtroom." The officer did not waver. "You are charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, and abuse of power." The judge gripped the bench. His knuckles were white. "This is a mistake." Leavitt watched without a word. A sharp clatter echoed through the room, the judge's own gavel slipping from his grasp, hitting the desk with a hollow thud. But this time, it was not his ruling. It was his sentence. Cameras flashed. Whispers spread. His face twisted, no longer mocking, no longer confident, just desperation. The officer pulled out the handcuffs. Cold metal snapped shut around the judge's wrists. "Stand up," the officer ordered. The judge hesitated. His body was stiff, his breaths uneven. Slowly, he rose. He turned, facing the courtroom that had once obeyed his every word. Now they watched him fall. As he was led away, he cast one last glance toward Leavitt. She met his gaze without fear. The door swung open. The officers disappeared with their prisoner. And with that, justice had the final word. The courtroom was empty now. The voices had faded. The chaos had settled. But the weight of what had happened remained. Karoline Leavitt stood at the front, her hands resting on the desk where the judge once sat. The man who mocked her, who dismissed the truth, was gone, led away in handcuffs, stripped of the power he abused for years. Justice had spoken, but the fight was far from over. Outside, the world was watching. News alerts flashed across every screen. Headlines spread like wildfire. Federal judge arrested in corruption scandal. Bribery, fraud, and abuse of power exposed in court. Karoline Leavitt's case shakes the nation. Reporters gathered at the courthouse steps, their voices overlapping, their cameras rolling. A microphone was placed in front of Leavitt. She did not hesitate. She spoke clearly, her voice unwavering. This case was never about politics. It was about truth. It was about proving that no one, no matter their title, no matter their connections, is above the law. Flashes erupted. The crowd pressed closer. She continued. For too long, those in power have believed they are untouchable. They have made their own rules, silenced those who stood against them, and used their influence to escape justice. Today, that changed. The energy in the crowd shifted. Some nodded. Some clapped. Some simply listened. Leavitt held up a folder, the same one she carried into court. This case is over, but the fight is not. Corruption does not begin or end with one man. There are more, and we will expose them. A reporter called out. What happens next? Leavitt met his gaze. That depends on all of us. The message spread far beyond the courthouse. Across the country, people talked. They argued. They debated. Some called her a hero. Others called her a threat. But no one could ignore her. In government offices, officials whispered behind closed doors, wondering who would be next. In homes across America, people sat with their families, watching the news, realizing that maybe, just maybe, the system was not as untouchable as they once believed. And in the halls of power, where secrets were buried deep, a warning had been sent. The truth had a voice, and it would not be silenced. Leavitt stepped away from the microphones. The case was won, but the real battle had just begun. She walked down the courthouse steps, past the flashing cameras, past the reporters shouting her name. She had done what many thought was impossible. She had brought down a corrupt judge. She had proven that justice was not just a word, it was a force. But as she looked at the faces in the crowd, she knew the question was not if corruption would return. It was when. She turned, taking one last look at the courthouse. And as she walked away, one question remained. What do you think? Did justice truly win today, or is this just the beginning?